Good day to you, my dearest viewer. I am your favorite extra-dimensional non-material being from beyond the veil of space-time, Kane, and today, as a sort of reaction to a certain someone facing consequences for their actions, I wish to talk about the absolute nonsense that is the concept of a modern Second American Civil War, and why most talk around and about it is at best bullshit and at worst a cynical attempt at subverting democracy and the rule of law. Now, most of you have probably seen talk of it in public life from YouTubers, influencers, your favorite neighborhood preppers, doomsday cultists, conspiracy theorists, and politicians, advocating for or prophesizing about a revolution, a national divorce, or the prospects of an 1861-side good old American Civil War if something doesn't go their exact way, and I'm here to give you my thoughts and insight into why this is mostly complete rubbish. I will focus on three of the, in my opinion, most important aspects of this to show you why most of it is bonkers. After I have finished talking about these aspects, I will talk about what an actually likely scenario might be for a civil conflict in the United States and the actual implications of this very topic in the public discussion. I wish not to waste more time with this as it is necessary, so let's jump in. Now, the first aspect, which in my opinion is one of the most important, is people. The people of the US, be their average citizens or politicians or influencers. I think it is obvious that most people are generally sane and rational, even if they have serious disagreements. What I mean by that they generally are trying to serve what they see as their interest and preserve their own existence. When it comes to influencers or politicians, they have a vested interest in keeping their jobs by making people listen to them. Often this means saying outlandish and radical things that invite attention, like we need a national divorce, or we should drain the swamp, or simply the ominous there will be a storm. Now the implications of war are terrifying, I don't have to tell you that. For example, people can die in it. Yes, I know only the most groundbreaking revelations on this channel. Revelations like how the consequences of this rarely touch those preaching the loudest. So, because of how people are removed from the possible consequences and implications of such a conflict, it is extremely easy to talk the talk for them, if you know what I mean by that. A lot of people like to boast or talk about what they would do in a situation of danger. Most of us are probably familiar with the type, one who talks about how easily they would stop a robbery or an attack and stuff. But the thing is, most people naturally don't like to be in harm's way. It is extremely easy to talk of war and violence when it's not there directly affecting them. I think Republican Congressman Andrew Clyde's case is a good example to demonstrate this. He's a pro-Trump Republican who voted against certifying the election in 2020 and shared in Trump's conspiracy theories. During the January 6th insurrection, he was seen frantically barricading the door that led to the chamber of the House of Representatives from the angry mob. He later downplayed the events in a show of political talking. Politicians like Clyde say whatever benefits them at the moment, but we can see them break the moment the situation actually has stakes. People like the idea of doing certain things, like uprisings where they can finally bring justice and impose their ideas on the world, but when it comes to the casualties and consequences, they usually don't want to suffer them. It also plays into this that though usually on the far right of American politics they like to paint themselves as victims, they are most of the time living comfortable and ridiculously privileged lives. They are generally more akin to entitled children on the playground throwing temper tantrums over having to share toys than the oppressed hungry masses of Paris and St. Petersburg. I also have to mention what I have seen talks about is that the soldiers and how generally in the United States soldiers and veterans lean Republican, and to that I can say two of the following things beyond what I have already said. 1. There is not to reason why, there is but to do and die. You are arguably generally not paid in the military to have an opinion. In a hypothetical scenario such as this, the federal military is basically guaranteed to side with the Unionists, and for those who don't want to, well, it was not a request. And the second is, though military insurrection is not unheard of, ask any soldier to turn their weapons on their brothers and sisters in arms, and you might just see what chemically pure rage looks like on a person's face. If you value the continued integrity of your facial structure, I suggest not to ask such things from them. People are complicated, but if they are not psychopaths, and most people aren't, chances are they have a strong feeling against being hurt or losing everything they have for barely tangible reasons. And on this note, let's talk about the proposed sides. Now, I am willing to wager that most who have seen content about the future Second American Civil War have seen maps like these. They generally operate under at least several faulty assumptions that I think strengthens the case that people either don't take this seriously or put in absolutely no effort. The sides in this theoretical conflict realistically will not be Democrats versus Republicans or left versus right. A conflict like this would be a war between secessionists and unionists. I will call them secessionists for the sake of simplicity, whatever their goals might be, either to make a new nation or overthrow the current one. The secessionists in all situations will be heavily outnumbered. To better understand why, I will give you examples. First, we take the late American Civil War. A lot of pro and meh slavery voters lived in northern states, yet the North was able to normally do its functions, and several slave states remained in the Union, like Delaware, whose slaveholding governor told the Confederacy that Delaware was the first state to join the Union and the last state to leave it. Now, just because someone is a Republican doesn't mean they fancy rebellion. Like, I struggle to find any tangible proof on the contrary, and remember what I have said in the first segment, just because someone says something about violence when it has no stakes doesn't mean that they are going to follow up on it. Putting it aside for a second how non-realistic such a situation would be, what the forces present in a possible secession crisis scenario started by Trumpists could look like is that a small core of secessionists facing off against patriotic Democratic and Republican right-wingers who remain loyal to the Union, independents who generally don't subscribe to these radical ideas of secession, and most likely the entire left with the entirety of the federal and most of the state governments behind them. Beyond this, it has to be mentioned that such a crisis would most certainly involve a multitude of US allies and even neutral states who seek to support the US to maintain the global status quo, as such a conflict would collapse the global economy and create a massive and dangerous power vacuum. Therefore, they have a vested interest in keeping the US together. Even if 100% of Republicans fully supported an uprising, they would still be heavily outnumbered, but that scenario is nearly completely impossible as they are not a faceless suicidal blob of rebels. They are people. The divide between where the ideological camps live have also changed since 1861. Urged by slaveholding planter upper class who had most of the power, several states announced secession. Though the South was ideologically relatively united behind their politicians, they faced their own rebellions and secession crises. Unionist militias and uprisings plagued their efforts, and an entire new state was formed from Unionists who left Virginia because they hated the secession. Today, this is much less about being southern or northern and more about the urban and rural divide. It is much more complicated than that. For example, a lot of Democrats live in rural places and a lot of Republicans live in cities, but let's roll with this for sake of simplicity. Because of this, all major population centers in a theoretically secessionist state where secessionists outnumber the Unionists, their centers of economy, industry, trade and governance would be powder kegs and concrete jungles full of people absolutely despising them. And even with this, we are already off the grounds of reality, because even conceptually, a secessionist majority state seems unrealistic, because remember, not even the majority of Republicans would probably support it based on the tangible data at hand. In contrast, states where Unionists outnumber the secessionists, projecting law and order through a relatively pro-secessionist countryside would not be that much of a difficult task because any secessionist power base would be dispersed and heavily outnumbered, so it wouldn't really fall out of the business as usual category for any semi-competent government authority force on Earth. This doesn't mean that it would be nothing of note, but it's not the all cities are under siege scenario that What If Art is made up, for example. Speaking of What If Artist, this is absolutely my favorite map when it comes to this lunacy, where you can see a few blue dots in a sea of red. Newsflash! Land doesn't vote. People vote. Cities house millions of people in relatively small places and nothing would stop them to just walk out of the city into the plains. Most of that land is empty, and adding to that, the uniqueness of the United States electoral system means that if, for example, a place has a population of 50,000 and the Republicans won with 25,001 votes and the Democrats have lost with 24,999 votes, then it appears red. It doesn't mean that everyone in the geographic area is Republican, much less a secessionist. Such a conflict would also not happen overnight. It would probably be days, weeks, or even months of standoff and a gradual transition to this conflict. The Republican and Democratic hive minds wouldn't just send out signals, assume firing positions and take over the government from one moment to another. Now, finally, let's talk about the gun question. Hands up who have heard this or something similar. One side collects military-grade weapons and the other pronouns in their Twitter bios. Now, beyond the fact that these kinds of memes are poor indicators of how things are in reality, there are really two major things to unpack here. First of all, this projects a false image of who actually owns the weapons. Second, that it wrongly assumes that this would decisively matter in a high-intensity long-term conflict. It is no secret that the US has a ridiculous number of firearms in circulation, more than the population in fact. However, there are a few caveats. First, only about a third of the US population actually owns guns. More live in households which own guns, but it projects the image that a very small number of people hug all of the weapons. Second, though generally more conservatives and registered Republicans own guns, around 40 to 50% depending on which way you look at it, Democrats and Independents also hold a significant number of firearms, around 20 to 30% respectively, a number that is generally understood to be on the rise, by the way. The common myth that the liberals and leftists are disarmed pushovers is just a myth. Liberals also own a shit ton of guns, and leftists, especially more radical leftists, are one of the most armed political groups beside conservatives in the US. The third is how this doesn't really matter in a prolonged and high-intensity conflict people advocating for civil war fantasize about. Though a lot of arguments can be made on this front, the bottom line is most of these weapons are simply not made for it. Most of them are handguns and small arms, not automatic, doesn't have reliably standardized capabilities, and can't take on tanks, artillery, aircraft and naval assets. What is even more important is that the logistical needs are not met. To keep weapons operational, you need factories, supply lines, depots and logisticians, all reliant on not just the interconnected trade in the whole country from factories, mines and supply chains, often centered around the concrete jungles which would be extremely hostile in a theoretical civil war, but global trade as a whole, and these are just the simple tools like rifles, not even the more sophisticated machinations of death and destruction you need nowadays. What is more, a war is not just soldiers, in fact it's mostly not soldiers. Anyone who studied war more than a superficial scroll through the flashy large tank engagements of the Second World War knows that war, especially a modern war, requires an extreme amount of supply and support. You need transportation, depots, logisticians as I have mentioned, mechanics, training, highly educated personnel. A modern soldier requires months of training, food, equipment, electronics, not just a shirt, pants, salt beef, hardtack, a rifle, powder, bullet and optional boots. It is extremely labor-intensive and time-consuming that poorly organized citizen militias simply can't keep up with in a conventional war environment. These weapons are good for something else, however, which I have to give, something that will not involve states seceding and armies marching on Richmond and Washington. So, what is an actually likely scenario in a violent civil conflict in the United States? Well, insurgency. Just to be clear, it would be an extremely difficult thing to pull off for any extended period of time on any meaningful scale and consistency. Nevertheless, it is something that has several modern examples. Time has proved that a small number of relatively organized groups of terrorists with easily obtainable small arms and tangible local support within dense natural and artificial environments like in cities, swamps, mountains or heavily forested regions could in theory cause death and chaos on a localized level, attack government buildings and forces, shoot up protests and opposition rallies, public places and carry out assassination attempts against local VIPs. And this is not a removed or far-fetched idea, even in the US. There were groups there who wanted exactly that, either planned or carried out attacks, like the KKK, Atomwaffendivision, the 3%ers, or the Proud Boys, just to name a few. And these are just the more organized forces. It could be as little as one madman with access to firearms and artificial fertilizer and a minimal chemical knack to produce a detonator. If there would be any deadly violent civil conflicts in the United States in the near future, and that is already a big if there would be any such things, the most likely scenario is that these kinds of groups sprung up and carry out attacks and wage a localized low-intensity conflict with government forces. Now, this could theoretically open the floodgates, with other groups arming themselves and the tensions boiling over into a nationwide bleeding Kansas-like situation, but I don't see that happening in the near future on any scale that could actually threaten the nation's continued existence. Now, I have one final thing to say before I close this video off, really the reason why I made this video in the first place. I've had a few talks and arguments with people in the past where it was argued that the decision to lock Donald J. Trump up is a dangerous choice between justice and order, meaning that you can either lock Trump up and condemn the US into violent civil conflict, or let him do his things and maintain order in exchange. This notion is exactly why this sinister and cynical made-up threat exists in the first place, to plant the idea that you either give the far right what they want, or else. But they are not as powerful and united as they would like you to believe. They are fearmongering as usual to manipulate you into giving up power to them, to give up your personal rights and freedoms. Despite what they are saying and the chest beating that they're displaying, people generally don't like to take on the honor of being the first to step forward, because if not enough people follow them immediately, they will just be arrested and, well, bullets hurt. Do they really want to be the first to die? They will just think, let the others do that, and we will follow them and share in their glory afterward. But if everybody thinks that way, eventually no one will step forward, especially if the consequences are swift and immediate. If they have time to step forward, though. The law is the order. I'm not saying everything is perfect, far from it. What I am saying, however, is that if you are willing to break the laws at will, which are foundations of an ordered society and the rule of law, if you're willing to undermine the justice system because of threats, you are playing exactly into their hands, be them a political group or a criminal empire. When laws no longer matter, anybody could just do whatever they want, and the far right could freely threaten anyone into submission and freely roam the streets to enforce their twisted vision of the future. There is no scenario where ignoring the foundational tenets of a rules-based society causes that society to be more ordered. On the contrary, in fact, that is how nations descend into tyranny and anarchy. This is the difference between a free and democratic society and a closet authoritarian one. In an optimal democratic society, nobody is above the law, and the laws matter beyond when they are convenient. And that is why people talk about the Second American Civil War, why they are threatening with it, why they are saying that we need a national divorce, why we need to violently overthrow the government and drain the swamp and storm the Capitol. Do not give in to threats of violence. If you like this video, please like, comment and subscribe. I was Kane, and I am the real Satan Claus.